civil rights, possessions, and in the end, it removed them from German society altogether. But first, Hitler targeted the people who were physically and mentally disabled. They did not measure up to Hitler's idea of the master race. The euthanasia program had the cooperation of nurses, doctors, and office workers. The German public protested, and the program continued on a smaller scale and in secrecy, and became the model for the extermination of Jews, but this time there was no protest. Kristallnacht. You can see in 48 hours what happened. I can see. There was something like 1,000 synagogues destroyed, 7,500 business vandalized, and 90 people were killed, and 30,000 men arrested and sent to concentration camps. Now, all this information of what's going on in Germany was reaching my mother in Poland. So what Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf were becoming reality. September 1st, Hitler, of 1939, Hitler attack on Poland. The first person in my mother's family who suffered was Sala. A bomb fell on her building. She managed to escape with her 2 little boys, and eventually she made her way a week later to the rest of the family. And her brother Sedek was swept away by a mass of people running from war. So 2 weeks later, he somehow was able to return. But this is in my mother's voice from page 107. She described the scene when the bombings were occurring. The scene from the attack on Warsaw is so vivid. I will remember them always. I saw a dead man on the street still clutching a sack of his belongings. A few steps further, a young woman lay on the pavement, calling out for help. Blood gushed from her legs. We had to jump over dead bodies as we were running for cover. It took all my strength to keep going. I was terrified. The black sky, the smell of smoke, and the deafening sounds penetrated everything. I had never known such fear. I tried not to look at the corpses around me. I let Paula take over. She would tell me when to run and when it was safe to stop. I was no longer rational. All I wanted was for the bombing to stop. After a month of bombing, Poland surrenders. The government and the armed forces escape into exile and bravely fight the Nazis alongside allies. This is all documented in military history. My focus is more on how the citizens behaved. Fear of Germans, and my mother is running east. This is in my mother's voice from page 129. So my mother is saying goodbye to every member of her family, and the last person she says goodbye to is her brother Adek. I handed over to him my most precious possessions, a box filled with my diplomas, a few of my favorite books, and an album with photographs. I told him to take care of it. My parting words were, I will see you in a few weeks. At the time, England had promised to help Poland fight the Nazi invasion. We also had heard rumors that the Russians were going to occupy more of Polish territories. All this gave me hope that Poland would soon be rid of Nazis and I would be returning home to family. Besides some clothes and food that I could carry, I left everything behind. Slide 10. So this is the map that you see. This was my mother's neighborhood, her parents' neighborhood. and their parents' neighborhood. So I was able to trace my family's history. Now, the records are very destroyed, so I wasn't able to find everything, but I was able to find it going back to probably 18th century. This was, oh sure, this was, every street that's listed on that map is, my mother writes about. This was her home. So this is how it started, and this is what my mother saw. And this is also from page 114. It's about the endless roundup of men. We were aware of what was going on. The men were taken away, were not coming back. We learned that we're beaten, starved, and forced to work under unimaginable conditions. More and more people started running away from Warsaw. At first, it was mostly men. At this time, there still existed the notion that the great German civilization would never hurt women and children. She also saw how the Germans were coming in with their lorries and breaking into businesses and removing everything, goods and equipment. This is how it started. How it ended, and this is the next thing that I will tell you, it's taken from history. How it ended. The Warsaw Ghetto was enclosed by a wall that was over 10 feet high and topped with a barbed wire. It was closely guarded to prevent movement between the ghetto and the outside world. The population of the ghetto increased as Jews from nearby town forced to move here. The population was estimated to be over 400,000, and thousands more were forced to move in. Typhus, starvation, along with random killings, claimed 100,000 people. This even before the Nazi massive deportation from the ghetto's Umsplatz. Umsplatz is the train station to the Treblinka extermination camp. Jews lived as condemned before they were murdered. The ghettos were the temporary storerooms. So my mother's family in Warsaw is unaccounted for. By this, what I mean by this is that we don't know where and how they were murdered. This was taken from archives records. Swedish doctors came and witnessed the conditions, observed how 400 to 600 Jews were dying of hunger daily in the Warsaw Ghetto. On Nazis' orders, Adam Czerniaków was in charge of the Warsaw Ghetto. He committed suicide. In the summer of 1942, 300,000 Jews were deported from the Warsaw Ghetto and murdered in Treblinka. This is the greatest slaughter in a single city in human history. A loss of life greater than Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. On Nazis' orders, the Łódź Ghetto was ran by Chaim Rumkowski. He gave up the young and the old to try to save the largest working ghetto in Poland. September 1942, my father's mother, father, and sister were taken from the Łódź Ghetto, murdered on arrival in Auschwitz. In Auschwitz, 90% of those murdered were Jews, but also murdered were Romas, gays, Jehovah's Witnesses, priests, Poles, political prisoners. The safe houses were never safe. Dennis Klein, professor at Kean University in New Jersey, who wrote the foreword to my book, while researching memoirs of Holocaust survivors, discovered a common thread. He coined a narrative of betrayal. Jewish citizens were betrayed by their neighbors during World War II. Since 1953, the righteous among the nations are honored in Israel's Yad Vashem. Poland had the largest number of righteous Gentiles, 6,700. But the righteous Gentiles were terrified not only of the Germans, but also of their Polish neighbors. Too many gave them up to the Nazis for helping Jews. The safe houses were never safe. It took many righteous Poles to cooperate and save a Jewish family, but it only took one Polish Nazi sympathizer to give them all up. And in communist Poland after the war, those who helped Jews could not talk about it for decades afterwards. But let's talk about the heroes, those who tried to alert the global community. Nazi brutality was chronicled by Witold Pilecki, a Polish soldier who got himself arrested and sent to Auschwitz. He lasted 2.5 years before escaping. He set off the alarm about the mass gassing of Jews in Auschwitz. After the war, Pilecki was murdered by the Polish communists. He was marked as the enemy of Poland. Irena Sendler, a social worker, rescued over 2,000 children out of the Warsaw Ghetto. Imagine a parent handing over a child to perfect strangers. She was arrested and tortured, but she did survive. She died in 2008. Jan Karski, a Polish officer, in 1942, delivered pleas to FDR, the Polish government in exile, and to the Allies about the conditions of Polish Jews. His pleas fell on deaf ears. The second part of my book, which is slide 11, will take place in Russia. And for the most part, my mother, her sister Paula, and brother Sedek are together, but I try not to use too many names because I think it gets a little bit confusing. So I'll usually talk about my mother. Let's talk about Russian history. So interesting. October Revolution of 1917, the Red Army of workers and peasants triumphs. Bolsheviks become the communists. Lenin, their leader. The first communist state is born. Lenin overthrows the provisional government that was installed after the Tsar abdicated the throne. Mensheviks were a large democratic party who were against Lenin's use of violence. Lenin saw violence as the only answer. So what does he do? He massacres the Mensheviks. This is exactly what Hitler will do later. After Lenin's death, which was only 7 years later, Stalin was determined to make Russia a modern country. He puts all the blame on Russia's backwardness on, of course, the workers and the peasants, the people who made Russia a communist country. He embarked on a brutal and ruthless plan known as the Second Revolution. Millions of small, successful private farms are confiscated, replaced with large state-owned collective farms run by communists. Those who refused are sent to the Gulag. During Stalin's era, the Gulag slave labor becomes of industrial magnitude. We have to mention the Ukrainian famine, an assault on peasants. Ukrainians were starved by Stalin. At gunpoint, he confiscates their grains to sell up for cash. He has to have cash, and that's the only way he can get it. Walter Duranty, a Pulitzer Prize-winning correspondent for the New York Times, lead the cover-up of the famine in Ukraine, a mass starvation of some 4 million people. But we have heroes here too. Gareth Jones, a Welsh journalist, Malcolm McGrich, English journalist, Fred Beale, an American journalist who was also a communist, visit Ukraine and found villages and fields littered with bodies, and all wrote about it. Guess what? The mainstream media would not publish them. My mother would be in Russia in 6 years from this time. In 1939, Hitler and Stalin make a non-aggression pact between them, dividing up Poland along the Bug River in the east. The Russians did not fire one shot while Hitler was bombing Poland, but Stalin was ruthless to the Polish population, arresting, imprisoning, and resettling whole families to Siberia and the remote Kazakhstan. Anyone who criticized Stalin or Russia was an enemy. But Stalin does not single out the Jews at this time. This comes right after World War II. Escaping East. Slide 12. My mother's group of 6 paid their way to illegally cross the Bug River. Their journey is on foot, a freight train, horse and buggy. Passing the different villages, they are advised to shed their street clothes and dress as peasants. And on their last stop, they have to wait for a moonless night so that the fishermen can take them on a boat and cross the river, which they finally do. On the Russian side, the minute they get off the little boat, they are arrested by the Russian Border Patrol and held the whole night in a barn with another 100 people who also get arrested. And in the morning, they're chased out for illegally crossing the border. So what happens here? My mother, under any conditions, she knows she's not going back to the German-occupied Poland. She throws herself on the ground, and Paula and her friend Reginka do the same, and they are crying hysterically. The sight of them sobbing and holding on to each other must have touched the Russian soldier. He gives orders to the villagers who have come to watch this spectacle, and he tells them to help them. Now, imagine this. Imagine if this was a German soldier. You know that they each would have got a bullet in their head. So this is a nice, heartwarming story, if you want to use those words, because he comes back the next day and to check up on her to see if she needs to go to the hospital. So the Russian soldier doesn't speak a word of Polish. My mother doesn't speak a word of Russian, but the villagers do, because that area is always either Polish or Russian, so they translate. So he comes to make sure she's okay, but he also tells her that she has to go to the next town over, which is called Białystok, and that she cannot stay there. So the local family takes them to Białystok. This is where all the refugees gather. The Russian government forces the refugees to register. So they're going to be living and working for Mother Russia. So they travel deep into the Russian interior. They travel for 6 weeks. They never wash or change their clothes. Their job is going to be bricklayers. They're going to be building a new town. But my mother manages to get a job in a factory. She'll be working there from 1940 until 1942. And her family that left Warsaw for Russia after World War I rescues her. She has 7 cousins, 5 women and 2 men. They are about her age, maybe a little bit older, because they remember her when she was a toddler. She doesn't remember them. They send her food parcels from Moscow, making sure that she no longer lives on only the factory rations. And cousin Itzhak is a Yiddish theater director, and my mother fell in love. He visits her many times for the next year and a half. Meanwhile, my mother's brother Sevek is arrested in the summer of 1940 in Saratov by NKVD, the Russian secret police. He's sentenced to 5 years of hard labor in the Gulag. He was arrested for attempting to return to the Eastern Territories. Illegal for him because he signed a contract. My mother went to prison to beg for his release, but it did not work. 2 years later, he was released in January of 1942. He was released and sent to the front. He never held a gun before. My mother saw her brother for a few hours while he was changing trains in Saratov. She pleaded for him to go underground, but he refused. That means to go into hiding. But he did tell her the story of his arrest and how he survived. But I'd like to read to you just a short passage in my mother's voice, how he looked. This is in my mother's voice from page 178. Our brother was alive, but he looked dreadful, thin, frail. He seemed almost half dead. He was wearing a padded cotton pants and a jacket that had been patched so many times it was impossible to tell the original color. His head was partially covered with a worn-out cap. He had no shoes. His feet were wrapped in rags and bound with string. His skin was so weather-beaten, he looked like he was 57 instead of 27. A little history about this. So, Polish army was forming on Russian soil. This was forced on Stalin. So it wasn't that Stalin was a nice guy. He was forced to do this by Polish government in exile, England and America, in exchange for helping Stalin fight Hitler. Stalin had manpower. A lot of it was enslaved in the Gulag. And the first wave of 600,000 men was released, and 175,000 were immediately mobilized, and this was Sevek's group. So what was exchanged for that? What Stalin got in exchange? A lifeline of English and American supplies for the soldiers was coming through in vast amounts. Uniforms, boots, blankets, belts, soap, and canned goods. All the things Stalin didn't have. Stalin never believed that Hitler's plan was to attack Russia. And for this reason, he also never ensured that Russia had a food surplus. Sevek was sent to Astrakhan, southern Russia, end of January 1942. He must have been killed there. And after serving in the Red Army during World War II, Alexander Solzhenitsyn was sentenced to 8 years in labor camp, and after to an internal exile. By this, what we mean, he could only live in certain areas of Russia, that is, remote areas of Russia. He could not enter cities. For criticizing Stalin in a private letter, he exposed the enormity of Stalin's machinery in the Gulag forced labor system. Gulag Archipelago is one of his books. Slide 13, please. When Hitler's army attacked Russia on October 1941, my mother lost contact with her entire Russian family. She was never again able to find any of them, even after the war. A little history about this. Dire conditions existed inside Moscow when the city was under siege. Close to 1 million Russians died defending their city more casualties than that of the US and Britain during all of World War II. Those were ordinary men and women who took up arms to defend Moscow. My parents joined the Polish army. The soldiers are going to the remote region of Uzbekistan for the training. But here, their lives become hopeless. Subsisting on army rations evaporate after my father doesn't pass the medical evaluation. The next 4 years in Guzari, Kamushin, Gitak, and Karshi, they are looking for work and food. My father finds work, but the meager food rations leave them hungry, and their energy goes into appeasing their non-stop hunger. People were dying of malaria, dysentery, typhus exposure. My mother was offered jobs like to bury 50 people in a mass grave, but she refused. My mother writes about being sick with malaria, the attacks leave her unable to stand upright, about participating in the black market. Everybody participated to survive. I'd like to read a short passage about how the illegal market worked. This is in my mother's voice from page 231. The men worked hard, carrying bags of wheat back and forth all day long, loading them into trains. The storehouse operated in 3 shifts, but the night shift was the most profitable. Although the night watchmen stood guard and watched carefully, the workers were able to pour the grain of wheat into their pant legs, tightly secured at the bottom so that the grain would not fall out. The guards were also paid off to look that way. Paula was soon buying 1 or 2 kilograms of this wheat from the workers several times a day. She went back and forth to the market where she sold some of the grain at a higher price. Wheat was their most precious possession because they would grind it into flour and make dumplings, and this is what kept them from starving. But also why collectivization didn't work and why the stores were always empty. Workers on a collective farm that was successful and produced more food got the same wages as those on a farm that produced little. Workers were not paid fairly for the work they did, and so naturally everyone chose to work less. The results were empty shelves in markets and people who did not care. The Russian people relied on buying and selling on the black market, trading among themselves for items they needed to subsist on. And actually this happened to be true after the war in Poland. My father was arrested the second time. It was in the winter of 1942. The Russian government called for refugees to become citizens. The rumor was that whoever became a Russian citizen would have to stay in Russia forever. 14, please. Well, this is just, I just wanted you to see that some statistics there. My parents survived Russia together for only one reason: to return to their families they loved and left behind. This is the reason they fought so hard to stay alive. The largest number of people who survived was in Russia, and this was my parents' group. Okay, in Poland after the war, it was after communism was established that the refugees were allowed to return. They were directed to southwestern part of Poland, Germany, before the war. During this trip, my mother and her sister got separated. There was chaos, confusion, so many trains carrying refugees that Paula's train was somehow directed to the displaced person camp set up in Germany. They would not find each other for 10 years and reconnect in another 10 years. My parents would not join the Communist Party. The punishment? Possibilities were close to them. To support our small family of 4, they sold used clothing. All businesses were nationalized. The small private businesses were closely scrutinized by the government. Everyone lived in fear. Of arrest and breaking the strict law. But in order to survive, the strict law had to be broken. My parents sold new clothing and participated in the thriving illegal market to support us. This is in my voice. The war was over, but we still lived in fear. Our home was inspected often. The police came regularly, searching the apartment for illegal merchandise. It's easy to recall the fear in my mother's eyes when those raids occurred. I was home once sick with a strep throat when a surprise house check took place. A friend came running to warn my parents. My mother took the new clothing and shoes for sale and hid them under my covers. I remember the fear I felt that day. I watched 2 policemen go through our personal possessions from the large bed I shared with my sister, covered up by a thick comforter, blankets, pillows, and with all that illegal merchandise. That day we were lucky. The police did not check my bed. My father's frequent bouts of pneumonia during the war went untreated. He ended up with tuberculosis. His illness was diagnosed in 1951. He died in 1961. He was 49. The life-saving antibiotic developed in 1943 by Eibuszyc to treat tuberculosis was not available in Poland after the war. We had rationed medicine and waited a week for an ambulance to be dispatched to take him to a hospital. We waited and watched him die a slow and painful death. After my father died, my mother finally decided to be reunited with her sister. We waited in line to come to the US legally. My mother's sister and her husband vouched for our family of 3. We were leaving the old world when my mother was already in her mid-age. My mother was leading the only life she knew, abandoning the roots of her ancestors. And just to close this off, my mother would awake at 6 in the morning and take a 1-hour subway ride from the Bronx to Manhattan. With an address scribbled on a piece of paper and directions from strangers, she managed to get to work and back home again. She was determined to make the best of her new situation. She would not surrender. She took a job in a cosmetic factory, working for minimum wages and long hours. A couple of years later, she was working in a bank. In America, my mother found comfort in libraries and books. The first book in English she introduced me was A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. My mother never knew. As Hitler and his enthusiastic supporters were burning millions of books, America had a grassroots movement. Librarians and everyday people started an extraordinary program. 120 million small, lightweight paperbacks were collected for troops to carry and read while fighting fascism in Europe and the Pacific. The #1 book American soldiers read was that Three Girls in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. On Becoming Americans. Did you guys get that? Yeah, Three Girls in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. On Becoming Americans and joining the American culture. We understood that freedom cannot be ever taken for granted. I feel very fortunate to have been able to leave communism behind. We've always had a great attitude of being grateful, of being able to exist in a free world. Learning English was part of that pride and appreciation we felt for our new home. My mother made this possible. The sacrifices she made in the now was to ensure that my and my sister's future would be better. Thank you.